All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are breaking down what might be one of the most critical geopolitical puzzles of our time: America's deepening conflict with Iran. Now, this is a situation that's way more complex than the headlines might suggest. In fact, a really compelling analysis argues that America has walked right into a trap, one with no obvious way out. So, the big question driving our entire discussion today is pretty simple. Is there any escape route for America? Can it negotiate a peace, or does every single path forward just lead to an even bigger disaster? Well, according to the perspective we're digging into, when you really look at the strategic reality on the ground, the answer is, well, it's deeply unsettling. And this quote right here, it just sets the stage perfectly, doesn't it? It's a really provocative idea. It suggests that America is completely stuck in a strategic checkmate, where any move it makes, whether it's backing down or doubling down, is going to lead to a terrible outcome. To really understand this trap, we first have to look at the nature of this conflict itself. The analysis we're exploring today frames it as something pretty stark: an unwinnable war. This right here is a key concept: war momentum. Just think about the conflict in Ukraine. For years, both sides have understood the absolutely immense cost of continuing, but the war just grinds on. Why is that? It's because once a conflict gets going, it kind of stops being something leaders control and it starts controlling them. To stop means you have to admit defeat, and that's almost politically impossible. The argument is that this conflict is now caught in that exact same devastating pattern. Okay, so if the war has its own momentum, what about a ceasefire? Can't America just talk its way out of this whole mess? Well, according to this analysis, that option is the first dead end. It's called the ceasefire trap. So let's imagine America decides to negotiate. The thinking is that Iran's demands would be simple and absolute. First, a jaw-dropping $1 trillion in reparations for decades of sanctions. But honestly, it's the second demand that's the real poison pill: a total and permanent withdrawal of the U.S. military from the entire Middle East. And this is the trigger for a potential global crisis. To understand why that's such a big deal, we have to talk about something called the petrodollar. For decades, it's been the bedrock of American financial power. Here's how it works. Gulf nations, who are traditionally protected by the U.S. military, agree to sell their oil only in U.S. dollars. This creates a constant global demand for dollars. And then, crucially, they take those profits and invest them back into the U.S. by buying American debt. And this brings us to the stakes. We're talking about a U.S. national debt of around $39 trillion. It's a number so huge it's almost meaningless. The analysis argues that the only reason the U.S. can sustain this is because the petrodollar system guarantees that the world always needs its currency. You take that away, and the whole foundation of the American economy starts to look incredibly shaky. And this slide, it lays out the predicted chain reaction, the dominoes. First, without U.S. protection, the Gulf states are forced to make a deal with Iran. That likely means they stop selling oil for dollars, and the petrodollar system collapses. Seeing America in retreat, allies like Japan and South Korea could lose faith and start to rearm themselves. Over in Europe, a weakened U.S. could push the continent to make its own peace with Russia, fracturing NATO. And the final domino to fall in this cascade: the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, and the American economy, no longer able to finance its massive debt, just implodes. That is the ceasefire trap. Okay, so if a ceasefire leads to economic collapse, what about the opposite? What about escalation? A quick, decisive military strike? Well, this brings us to the second dead end: the invasion trap. On paper, the logic for a limited strike seems almost perfect. The target would be Karg Island. It's the hub for 90% of Iran's oil exports. You take it, and you cripple Iran's economy and its ability to fund the war. It sounds clean, simple, and decisive. But here's the catch. You can't just hold a tiny island that's sitting right off your enemy's coast. The moment U.S. forces land there, that island becomes a massive target for Iranian artillery and missiles from the mainland. So to protect the troops on the island, you suddenly have to secure the nearby coastline. And of course, you can't secure the coast without dealing with the huge Zagros Mountains that overlook it. So now you have to take the mountains too. And just like that, your limited strike has spiraled into a full-scale ground invasion of one of the most rugged, difficult countries on Earth. This is Mission Creep 101. And if this all sounds familiar, well, it's because it is. we have seen this exact movie before. Back in 1965, a so-called limited mission in Vietnam started with just 3,000 Marines. It ended with 500,000 troops bogged down in a war they couldn't win. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action. Once you've spent blood and treasure, it becomes politically impossible to admit you were wrong. You're in too deep, so you just keep digging. So you might ask, why not just commit to that invasion and win it? Well, that brings us to the core military problem here, a fundamental mismatch between how America is built to fight and the kind of war Iran is prepared to fight. Now, this brings us to what is maybe the single most shocking claim in this entire analysis. The idea that in wargame simulations run by the Pentagon to model this exact conflict, America loses every single time. Just let that sink in for a second. The most powerful military in world history simulates this war, and it loses. So why? It's because the two sides are playing completely different games with completely different playbooks. The U.S. military is built for shock and awe, using overwhelming air power and precision strikes to dismantle a traditional enemy. But the theory is, Iran has spent more than 20 years studying that exact playbook and has designed the perfect counter-strategy: asymmetric warfare. They don't line up their forces to be destroyed, they disperse, they hide, and they use their own unique weapons to hit America's biggest weaknesses. And this right here is that arsenal. It's not about matching the US tank for tank or plane for plane. No, it's about cheap, effective drones, advanced hypersonic missiles that are hard to stop, military facilities buried deep underground, and a whole network of proxy forces across the Middle East that can fight on Iran's behalf. This entire strategy is designed to neutralize America's strengths and turn its most expensive assets, like those massive aircraft carriers, into giant, vulnerable targets. So, if peace is a trap and war is a trap, is there any way out? Well, the analysis we've been walking through argues that there is, but it requires a solution so radical it would completely reshape America's place in the world. See, the argument is that this conflict with Iran isn't really an isolated problem, it's a symptom of a much larger issue, an overstretched American empire. By feeling like it has to be involved in every conflict, everywhere, all the time, America lets its adversaries drag it into these draining, expensive wars that ultimately just weaken its global standing. So the only real solution being proposed here isn't tactical, it's strategic. It's a fundamental pivot in American grand strategy, a shift away from trying to be the sole global dominator and toward becoming a genuine partner in a world with multiple great powers. And what would that actually look like? Well, it would mean rethinking a global military presence in 80 different countries. It would mean stopping the use of the dollar as a weapon through sanctions. And maybe most radically of all, it would mean sitting down at the table with rivals like Russia, China, and even Iran, not as a superior dictating terms, but as a peer, to build a new global system where everyone has a stake in keeping things stable. This isn't just a small policy change. It's a proposed revolution in American foreign policy. And that leaves us with this final, crucial question. At the end of the day, the analysis suggests the choice is between two futures, one of endless conflict, trying to maintain total domination, and another of shared power and partnership. The path America chooses will likely define not just its own future, but the future of the entire world in the 21st century.